The last Friday, Noriega and his military dictatorship declared a state of war with the United States and publicly threatened the lives of Americans in Panama. Was that enough? At this moment, United States forces, including forces deployed from the United States last night, are involved in the action.
The name Manuel Antonio Noriega Moreno resonates with controversy not only in the recent history of Panama, but in that of all the peoples of the Americas. A military man raised almost as an orphan in poverty, who during the 13 years of the developmental military government of Colonel Omar Torrijos managed to become the second most powerful man in Panama. At the same time, he became a trusted agent of the CIA and a protege of the United States government. But after the sudden death of Omar Torrijos in 1981, his right-hand man Noriega, a cunning and bold man, managed to rise as the new head of the Panamanian state, ushering in one of the most debated periods in Hispanic American history. A turbulent period marked by disputes over the Panama Canal, by the ambitions of the leading imperial power over its region, and by the historic nationalist and sovereign aspirations of Panamanian groups. All of this, moreover, wrapped up in accusations of drug trafficking, arms sales to both the left and the right under CIA instructions, and allegations of electoral fraud, and a Panama divided politically and socially. Thus, on December 20, 1990, the nation of Panama, with a territory 13 times smaller than Colombia's, and a population 25 times smaller than Mexico's, and with an army with 10 times fewer soldiers and equipment than Venezuela's. Panama wakes up that morning to the bombings and gunfire that signaled a military intervention by the United States government. An unprecedented and unique chapter in recent history, which has rarely been told in a clear and objective way. Just like the life of its main character, General Manuel Noriega, join us until the end to learn about this story and its tragic ending. This is Reynaldo Jose Carrillo Vilches from the New Encyclopedia. I invite you to support us by liking this video, leaving your comments, we always read them all, hitting the bell for notifications, of course subscribing to the channel, and sharing it with all your friends on social media, on WhatsApp, and anywhere else with nothing more to add. Let's start with today's story. The story of Manuel Antonio Noriega Moreno begins in Huachimango, a neighborhood in Panama City, the nation's capital, with the same name where Noriega was born on February 11, 1934. Noriega is the result of an extramarital relationship that his father, Tomas Noriega, a married man, had with his mother, Josefa Moreno. Manuel never established a direct relationship with him, since his father left him to his fate with his mother. On top of that, when he was only 5 years old in 1939, his mother died of tuberculosis. Little Manuel Antonio was then left in the care of his godmother, Luisa Sanchez, whom he would call Mama Luisa from then on, Manuel Antonio. He grows up near the old public market in Panama City amid severe economic hardships. Panamanian life at that time was deeply influenced by the United States of America in the so-called canal zone of the famous Panama Canal. To explain this situation, which will be extremely decisive, both in Noriega's life and in the life of Panama, we need to go back a few years historically from before, but especially after the arrival of the Spanish and the exploration by Europeans. The territory of Panama was an area that was always greatly influenced by the tremendous potential held by its unique geography. The Isthmus of Panama, where, like nowhere else on the continent, the separation between the Atlantic Ocean and the Pacific Ocean was so narrow, so short. All kinds of rulers, from King Charles V to the liberator Simón Bolívar, had the idea that when technological advances allowed it, an interoceanic canal could be built in that area. By the end of the 19th century, Panama was a state or department of the Republic of Colombia, formed after the complex processes of the War of Independence and the decades that followed. And during these same years, at the end of the 19th century, the Republic of Colombia granted a concession to the French company, the International Interoceanic Canal Society, which began the first excavations to build the much-desired canal. Until shortly after, in 1899, the company went bankrupt and the project was put on hold. On the other hand, the North American nation, attracted by the potential of Panama's anthem, they had been getting closer to the independence groups that were active among the Panamanian elite for some time, with the aim of supporting them so that they could achieve the consolidation of Panama's independence from the Republic of Colombia, and, as a reward, obtain the concession to be the sole builders, owners, and administrators of the Panama Interoceanic Canal. Years later, Panamanians officially declared Panama's independence on November 3rd, 1903, with the support of several warships and United States troops that were stationed in the area, and with the support of influential bankers who also lived in North America, such as J.P. Morgan. After independence, a revolutionary council was formed that chose Demetrio Britt as the first president of the newly created Republic of Panama. Quickly, the United States rushed to recognize the new government and immediately established diplomatic relations with it. And just 15 days after its independence from Colombia, Panama signed the famous Bunau-Varilla Treaty with the United States on November 18, 1903. With this treaty, Panama permanently ceded to the United States a strip of land 10 miles wide, which would be known as the Bunau Treaty, Panama, where the canal would be built, which would be administered solely and exclusively under the sovereignty of the United States of America. Despite the opposition of some Panamanian intellectuals and members of its elite, most of the influential men in Panama support the measure. Preparations for construction continue, with the creation of the Panama Canal Company, which begins construction of the canal on May 4, 1904. A decade later, on August 15, 1914, the Panama Canal, a brilliant work of engineering and human labor, is inaugurated with the first interoceanic voyage carried out by the American steamship, the SS Ancon. Quickly, the Panama Canal gains worldwide fame and thousands of vessels begin to transit through it to take advantage of the newly created advantageous maritime route. To delve deeper into the extraordinary history of the Panama Canal, we have a video dedicated especially to that story, which we invite you to watch on our channel. Returning to the events after the inauguration of the canal, new disagreements quickly began to arise between Panama and the United States of America. First of all, although the United States pays an annual rent of $250,000 to the Panamanian government, which had been set by the Bunau-Varilla Treaty, various sectors of Panamanian society considered this to be a very low amount, given the large revenues that the United States received from the administration of the Panama Canal. And secondly, as the years go by, more and more reports of alleged abuses and excesses by the Americans on Panamanian soil continue to surface. Regarding the Canal Zone, as we mentioned, the Canal Zone was a strip ceded to the United States and administered by them as an unincorporated territory, but under their laws and prerogatives. In this area, which is the epicenter of Panama's economic life, the United States built not only several important military bases, but also established a physical and social structure in this territory, in the image and likeness of many of the main American towns and cities. Urban complexes in the American style, schools, hospitals, offices, and telephone networks for the American workers and their families. Urban complexes. American. Schools, offices, American workers, urban complexes, school-style, telephone networks, Americans, school-style urban complexes, offices, American telephone networks, and American-style urban complexes. Schools, offices, American workers, urban complexes, schools, telephone networks for Americans and their families by the Panamanians. In this way, a strong nationalist sentiment is developing among the Panamanians, with special concern about the Panama Canal issue, which will gradually evolve until it became increasingly common in the nation to demand that the Canal Zone and the Panama Canal be handed over to the Panamanian nation. So this tension will mark the life of Panama forever, a republic established with United States guidance and support, remaining under its influence for a long time. But at the same time, it would try to find its own national path. At a time when North America was becoming not only the great power and police force of the entire American hemisphere, but of the whole planet. This is the historical moment in which a young Manuel Noriega finds himself. Panama is in a delicate political and even existential situation for his country. This will determine the course of his life and of the Panamanian nation in the coming years. So, going back to the life of our protagonist, Noriega. Despite his material shortcomings, Manuel Noriega manages to complete his primary education and is able to enter the National Institute, the oldest school in Panama. In his youth, Noriega, who prefers to be called Tony by his close friends, was already flirting with socialist and leftist ideas. In addition, he dreamed of becoming a doctor, but at that time medicine was a very expensive and hardly accessible career. The young Noriega was deeply frustrated by the impossibility of studying medicine. However, very soon, in a chance encounter, a close friend of his motivated him to take a path, a military career. Thus, in 1958, at the age of 24, Noriega gets a Panamanian scholarship to study at the prestigious Torrijos Military School in Lima, Peru, because he was over the age limit of 20 years to get the scholarship. His half-brother, Luis Carlos, who worked at the Panamanian Embassy in Peru, helped him alter his birth certificate so he could enter the Peruvian Academy. So, after 4 years of military training at one of the most prestigious institutions, Noriega graduated in 1962 from the Torrijos School as an ensign specialized in engineering, and he joined the National Guard of Panama as a second lieutenant when he turned 28 years old. The National Guard of Panama, like the Panamanian state, was born under the tutelage and with great influence of the United States, due to the agreements made with the United States. Since its independence, Panama never developed a national army. Specifically, so the National Guard was the main police and military body, while the United States maintained a strong military presence in Panama, in addition to its commercial and political presence with the canal as a member of the National Guard. Manuel Noriega's first assignment is the barracks in the city of Colón, where his life is going to take a decisive turn. When he meets and gets to know Major Omar Torrijos Herrera, another key figure in Panamanian national life, as we will soon see in another video. And after meeting and working together later on, Omar Torrijos would become Manuel Noriega's personal mentor and protector. Despite their different personalities, both military men forged a close relationship and collaboration that would define the course of Panamanian politics in the following decades. Noriega stood out for his tactical ability and his calculating nature, and thus he quickly became Omar Torrijos' right-hand man. However, Torrijos was not the only one who held him in high regard. He valued Noriega from his early years in the military field for the leadership that already set him apart from his fellow soldiers. Noriega was already on the radar of United States intelligence, which maintained contacts and relationships within the Panamanian National Guard as a crucial method to maintain United States control over the Panama Canal. In this way, Noriega ends up being formally recruited as a CIA agent and will begin to collaborate with the agency's activities in Panama, in addition to providing valuable information about political activities and movements in Central America during President Lyndon Johnson's 1960s administration. Noriega is referred to in the reports as, quote, an invaluable asset and a rising star within the Panamanian National Guard. Returning to another aspect of Noriega's life, a personal situation complicates his time in the National Guard, and it's the excessive alcohol consumption he had been engaging in for some time, added to violent behaviors that became evident shortly after he joined the National Guard. In fact, Torrijos had to intervene to help Noriega avoid the legal consequences of an accusation of abuse against a prostitute. In view of these problems, in 1966, Torrijos decided to send Noriega to spend several months studying at the so-called School of the Americas, an important United States military academy located at Fort Gulick, within the Panama Canal Zone under American administration. It is said that Torrijos sent Noriega to that place to, quote, set him straight, so there he continued his military and general training. And when Noriega leaves the School of the Americas, he is promoted to first lieutenant, and Omar Torrijos appoints him as intelligence officer of the National Guard in Chiriquí, in the north of the country, with the mission to infiltrate and destabilize the labor unions that were active in the Panamanian branch of the American company, the United Fruit Company, a task for which he shows great skill neutralizing the unions. It is in Chicory where Noriega meets Felicidad Cierro, whom he marries in the late 1960s. With her, he has 3 daughters during their marriage, Lorena, Sandra, and Thais. By 1968, Noriega Cierro, an event marks the political future of Noriega. That year, Arnulfo Arias. Madrid wins the presidential elections in Panama, but the conflict that arises with the military over introducing changes in matters such as promotions. This, along with other political and social factors, leads to the decision to carry out a coup d'etat. Led by then Colonel Omar Torrijos and Major Boris Martinez on October 11, 1968, which would mark the beginning of a new military government, with Torrijos as the general commander of the National Guard of Panama and as the top leader of the so-called Panamanian Revolution, after an internal struggle with other military officers. After the revolution for power, Torrijos consolidates his position as the strongman of Panama, and the loyalty of Noriega, who was now the right-hand man of the nation's main leader, became a crucial element for Torrijos. During the more than a decade that Omar Torrijos' government would last, a nationalist, authoritarian, and military regime was established in Panama, with a sort of head of state in the figure of the commander of the Panamanian National Guard and a sort of prime minister in the figure of the president. Torrijos' government raised the banner of Panamanian nationalism and had a developmentalist program with a mixed economic model where Panama, on one hand, became an international banking center, and at the same time the national electric system was nationalized, and more than 180,000 hectares of land were redistributed during these more than 10 years of Torrijos' government. Panama had an annual growth rate close to 7%. Its gross domestic product doubled, and it maintained an employment level above 94%. Major public works were also carried out. A significant number of schools and houses were built, and important labor reforms were implemented, and Panama was consolidated in the opinion of some scholars as an emerging nation in Hispanic America. However, it still had to face difficult economic and political times, as well as various cases of corruption. Now, one of the most important actions of the Torrijos government for the future of Panama and of Manuel Noriega would be their negotiations to achieve the transfer of possession of the Panama Canal to the Panamanian nation. but we will come back to this later. Let's return to Noriega and the early years of the Torrijos government, when Noriega gradually became Panama's second most powerful man. After Torrijos, in mid-December 1969, while Torrijos was on an official visit to Mexico, there was an attempted coup d'etat in Panama, and it was Manuel Noriega who helped control the situation and allowed Torrijos to return to the country safely. This support, among other actions, strengthens Noriega's position with Commander Torrijos. Once the situation was normalized as a reward, Torrijos promoted Noriega to captain, and then in August 1970, he promoted him to lieutenant colonel and to the crucial position of Chief of Military Intelligence of the Panamanian National Guard. From this position, Noriega proves to be a very skilled intelligence chief. He exiles about 13 people whom he considered a threat to the government and cleverly organizes several files and dossiers on army officials, government officials, and judicial officials. This intelligence information will allow Noriega to use persuasion or coercion as effective tools to maintain or increase control over Panamanian institutions. From the shadows, thus, throughout the 1970s, Noriega becomes the second strongman of the Panamanian regime and its enforcer, earning the nickname Torrijos' Gangster. Noriega is credited with being responsible for the disappearances of Father Hector Gallego in 1971 and student Rita Wald in 1976. Two strong opposition voices that were neutralized during the Torrijos regime. At the same time, since the 1970s, reports began circulating in Washington from the Drug Enforcement Administration that informed about the alleged involvement of Torrijos' second-in-command, Manuel Noriega, in drug trafficking in the region, not only allowing but orchestrating operations related to it. And even though they were fully aware of these reports and this information, the CIA and the United States government would continue not only to maintain very good relations with Noriega, but also to support his career in Panama. Also, according to some reports, around this time, Noriega supposedly began selling strategic information to Fidel Castro's Cuba, operations he allegedly conducted under CIA instructions. This issue was never clarified, according to Noriega's statements years later during his trial in the United States. But we'll come back to this later. At the same time, according to these reports, Noriega himself was getting involved in smuggling weapons to the leftist guerrillas in El Salvador and to the Sandinistas in Nicaragua, even though Torrijos had supposedly sanctioned him for these actions. Still, as Noriega says, his CIA relationship would continue. To this day, it's unknown who gave the instructions. He went on to support the Sandinistas, only to support their direct enemies in Nicaragua a few years later. We'll come back to this whole plot connected to the later military invasion of Panama. But first, let's return to the era of Omar Torrijos. As we mentioned, during the 1970s, he carried out one of the most significant actions in Panama's history. Thanks to his leadership, Panama launched a successful media and diplomatic campaign to gather support from various countries for the national demand that the Panama Canal be handed over to the Panamanian nation. In this regard, Torrijos achieved the historic signing of the Torrijos-Carter Treaty with the then United States President Democrat Jimmy Carter on September 7, 1977. This treaty began a process to transfer the canal to Panamanian hands and established that after 20 years, that is, in 1999, the sovereignty, defense, administration, and economic benefits of the Panama Canal would be entirely in Panamanian hands. But in the meantime, during this process, the treaty set some stipulations that will become relevant later in this story, such as, for example, the full and unrestricted right for United States warships to cross the canal in perpetuity, and that in the event of an armed conflict that caused the closure of the canal, both the United States and Panama would have the right to reopen it using whatever means were necessary. The Panamanian people enthusiastically welcomed news of the upcoming Panama Canal transfer. This treaty between the United States and Panama was also conditioned on the political stability guaranteed by Omar Torrijos and the maintenance of close political ties between the two countries. However, prominent sectors in the United States of America were not comfortable with the Torrijos-Carter Treaty and would look for every possible way in the near future to maintain direct or indirect American control over the canal, carrying out various maneuvers so that either the Torrijos-Carter Treaty would not be fulfilled or the implementation of its clauses would be postponed. When the Republican Ronald Reagan became President of the United States in 1981, supported by American sectors that openly advocated for strengthening and expanding the American empire across the entire planet, the United States' policy regarding the canal and the treaty would begin to change, and the fate of Panama and Noriega would turn toward a period of great controversies and conflicts in the Panamanian nation, as you will see later in this video. In this sense, July 31, 1981, marks a turning point in the life of Noriega and Panama, because General Omar Torrijos, the top military leader of the country, dies in a suspicious plane crash in the mountains of Coclechito, although the official investigation declares it an accident. Some theories emerge suggesting the possible involvement of Noriega, although none of them have conclusive evidence yet. The truth is that Noriega, being the second in command in Panama, knows how to quickly fill the power vacuum left by his mentor. Noriega avoids accusations of being involved in the death of Torrijos, while Moises Torrijos, the brother of the late general, makes accusations about the supposed accident and death to the CIA and to several actors from the local Panamanian oligarchy, sparking a strong controversy that deserves a separate video. Going back to the harassment after a brief period with Florencio Flores as Commander-in-Chief of the Panamanian National Guard, the real power in the country rested in 1982. In a sort of triumvirate led by Manuel Noriega and the military officers Roberto Diaz Herrera and Ruben Darío Paredes. Finally, Ruben Darío Paredes takes over as Commander-in-Chief of the National Guard, based on an agreement, so that the military, under the command of Noriega, who was the one holding the main authority over the armed institution, would cooperate to secure the presidential election of Ruben Darío Paredes in 1984. And in fact, on August 12, 1983, Ruben Darío Paredes handed over his position as Commander-in-Chief of the National Guard to Manuel Noriega, under the assumption, as we said, that Paredes would run as the favored candidate for the presidency. However, Noriega would soon break this agreement, preferring as presidential candidate a civilian he trusted with a good international image, such as the economist Nicolás Ardito Barleta. In this sense, Noriega, as Commander-in-Chief of the National Guard, is now the de facto leader of Panama, since ever since the Torrijos coup in 1968, the president of Panama was a figure with limited power compared to the Commander-in-Chief of the National Guard, who was the center of decision-making throughout the nation. One of Noriega's first actions, with a nationalist rhetoric, was to rename the National Guard of Panama as the Panamanian Defense Forces. With United States financial aid, he expands and modernizes them. Marto Rios had promised in 1978, 10 years after his coup, that Panama would move toward full democratization. But the time for the presidential elections was approaching, and Noriega, for his part, just like his mentor, was determined to control the results in favor of his candidate, the economist Nicolás Ardito Barleta, in the general elections. Noriega, Panama, May 6, 1984. The initial results indicate a clear victory for the 80-year-old opposition candidate, Arnulfo Arias, And this is when Noriega stops the count and announces the victory of Barletta, his candidate, which ends up sparking protests and riots that are harshly repressed by Noriega's regime. Despite the reported irregularities, the ruling class of the United States, those who had trained and raised Noriega, who was one of their agents, they decide to accept the victory of their candidate, Ardito Barletta, recognizing him as president and cooperating with him. Now, in 1984, Noriega was firmly established in power as the commander-in-chief of the Panamanian Defense Forces, the government work of Noriega, since the early 80s. When he succeeded Torrijos as the strongman of Panama, he distanced himself from the nationalist and developmentalist line of his mentor Torrijos and moved closer to a program of economic liberalization. In 1984, he allowed President Nicolas Ardito Barletta to implement a market-opening economic plan, also described by others as neoliberal, with privatizations, tariff liberalization, substantial reduction of public spending, and as a result, reduction of various public services, mass layoffs of public workers, wage freezes, among other reforms. This triggered initial social rejection, strikes, protests, and corruption allegations. Noriega responds as someone trained in the army and intelligence agencies, with strong control over the public administration and with surgical repression of the political opposition. At the same time, he maintains the construction of public works and the provision of various social services. Meanwhile, he maintains a considerable political and social base, built in part since the times of Omar Torrijos. Despite everything, Panama faces economic stagnation. And after these first years, in the midst of the political crisis that will occur years later and will lead to the military intervention, since 1987, the United States has imposed a series of economic sanctions on Panama, which included freezing funds, banning imports, and restricting credit. These measures ended up plunging the Panamanian economy into a financial crisis and causing it to regress. This situation was worsened by the fact that Panama never had its own currency, but instead used and was governed by the United States dollar. But let's go back to a fundamental issue in today's story, which is the relationship between Noriega's government and Panama with the government of the United States. As we've said from the beginning, the relationship between both nations has been marked by the desire for cooperation from some, but also by the tension between the nationalist aspirations of many Panamanians versus the aspirations of many Americans to maintain as much control as possible over the Isthmus of Panama Canal and the region. It was precisely this tension that was one of the political roots that gave rise to the revolution and the government led by Omar Torrijos in 1968, which is the movement and government that Manuel Noriega would inherit when Noriega became the strongman of Panama. Since 1981, the same year Ronald Reagan became president of the United States, his relations with the United States would remain in place with relative harmony, at least at first. The United States, as the continental hegemon, had immediate interests in the armed conflicts taking place in Nicaragua, El Salvador, and other possible Central American countries. That's why Ronald Reagan's administration sought to strengthen a temporary alliance with countries like Noriega's Panama. So, in his early years in power, Noriega played a key role by facilitating support from the United States, such as funds and weapons, to the guerrilla rebels in Nicaragua in their conflict against the Sandinista left. Noriega also continued to allow the use of Panamanian military bases for American intelligence, espionage, and counterinsurgency activities in the region. Now, as we said, the new administration of Ronald Reagan comes to power with a rhetoric and a policy of maintaining the United States as the hegemon in the world's police, accompanied by sectors that had strongly opposed the Torrijos-Carter Treaty and were interested in reversing it, or in maintaining by any means American primacy in that key sector. This whole issue will be decisive in the conflict that is going to come with Noriega. For example, the Torrijos-Carter Treaty established that the United States, by 1984, it had to close the School of the Americas, located on Panamanian soil, and hand it over to Panamanian administration. The School of the Americas was an enclave for military training, recruitment, and intelligence that the Americans had in most countries on the continent. However, shortly after Ronald Reagan came to power, the same year as Noriega, in 1981, American agents began to put pressure on Noriega so that he wouldn't close the School of the Americas, as was stipulated in the treaty, or at least delay its closure, or simply change its name, something that Noriega and his government refused to do. And by October of 1984, the School of the Americas was closed in Panama amid nationalist celebrations. Shortly after this, Noriega also began to refuse the new requests made by the United States to expand the use of their military bases in Panama. With the argument of fighting insurgency throughout the region, Noriega claimed that there was already enough United States presence on Panamanian soil and began to refuse several of these requests. All of this raises alarms because, in addition, Noriega, having been in contact for so many years with the United States government elite, handled a large amount of confidential and strategic information about the Americans in that region. Attitudes like the closure of the School of the Americas and Noriega's refusal to allow more bases within Panama, along with the rejection by some American sectors of a Torrijos-Carter Treaty that was moving forward, the gradual handover of the Panama Canal to the Panamanian ruling class. These are some of the main signs that lead the United States of America, who had already been forming friendships with the rest of the Panamanian political class for some time, began to look more favorably on other figures from the Panamanian opposition, different from Noriega, more allied with the North, more trustworthy and predictable as better options to govern Panama. So by the mid-1980s, a new open conflict begins between the government of Panama and the government of the United States colluding with the Panamanian opposition. A conflict that will lead to a military invasion, as we mentioned. According to United States Drug Enforcement Administration reports, Noriega will maintain drug trafficking operations in the 1970s and 1980s. With full knowledge of the United States authorities. From the very beginning, according to testimonies from drug lords or people involved in the drug business, Noriega allegedly even allied himself with the Medellin cartel, led by Pablo Escobar, to facilitate the transfer and laundering of money through Panama. Although the United States always approved of these activities and continued to support Noriega's career, it was in the mid-1980s that a national and international media operation began, with the first articles published in the press seriously denouncing Noriega's involvement in drug trafficking. At the same time, this was the era when, under Ronald Reagan, the narrative and policy of the so-called war on drugs became popular in the United States, and the belief that the United States had to do whatever was needed, both domestically and abroad, to win this so-called war. With the United States being the main country buying these substances in the entire world. In line with all this, in 1985, for the first time with force inside Panama, the drug trafficking activities of Noriega are publicly denounced by several sectors, even by former governments. Government members under Torrijos and Noriega included Hugo Espadafora, a doctor, guerrilla, and former key ally of Omar Torrijos. In 1985, Hugo Espadafora openly criticizes Noriega and publicly accuses him of having deep connections with international drug trafficking. Thus, at the beginning of September 1985, Hugo Espadafora declares that he is ready to reveal the alleged evidence about these accusations against Noriega related to his arms and drug trafficking network. However, on September 13, 1985, Hugo Espadafora is unexpectedly murdered, and his brutally decapitated body is found in Costa Rican territory, near the border with Panama. This event causes a major national shock. The then president, Nicolás Ardito Barletta, announces that he will appoint an investigative commission for this event. But after doing this, he is forced to resign by the high military command. The presidency of Panama, consequently, is assumed by Eric Arturo del Valle, the new trusted man of Noriega, who is placed in this position. The suspicions and accusations against Noriega of allegedly being the mastermind behind the murder of leader Hugo Espadafora keep multiplying in Panama, as well as various allegations of corruption within his government. The following year, in 1986, the New York Times published a front-page international article denouncing Noriega's involvement in the global drug trafficking business, in money laundering, and in other illegal activities. This publication also caused a scandal in Panama, and on one hand, sparked a wave of protest and rejection against him. It also strengthened internal cohesion among Commander Noriega's supporters amid what seemed like an international threat. In June 1987, Noriega's regime reached a new milestone. Colonel Roberto Diaz Herrera, the second in command of the Panamanian Defense Forces and cousin of Omar Torrijos, comes into conflict with Noriega. The reason for this is that in 1982, Noriega had made a pact with Roberto Diaz Herrera, agreeing to hand over power to him. 5 years later, that is, in 1987, the command of the Panamanian Defense Forces. However, Noriega once again broke this pact and forced his rival Herrera to retire from the army in retaliation. For this reason, on June 6, 1987, Colonel Roberto Diaz Herrera made a series of public statements accusing Noriega of that 1984 presidential electoral fraud, as well as the murder of Hugo Espadafora and alleged complicity in the death of Omar Torrijos. These confessions sparked a new major wave of protests in Panama, perhaps the largest Panama had seen up to that point. Manuel Noriega, now nicknamed Pineapple Face by the opposition because of his noticeable acne scars, responded with a harsh crackdown, declared a state of emergency, and suspended constitutional guarantees. Additionally, José Blandón, former Panamanian consul in New York, also made similar accusations against Noriega before the United States Congress. Had the United States ruling class, the CIA, and every American actor already completely turned their backs on Manuel Noriega? So in the midst of these protests, a diplomatic, economic, and media escalation from the United States began inside Panama, in alliance with the Panamanian opposition. For example, citing political repression, drug trafficking, and electoral fraud by the Panamanian government. Previously endorsed by the United States Senate approved on June 26 of that year, 1987, a resolution demanding the resignation of Manuel Noriega. Meanwhile, they urged the Panamanian opposition to protest. In response, Noriega organizes a protest on June 30 in front of the United States Embassy, which becomes quite violent. Amidst this conflict, the United States suspends military assistance to the Panamanian government and, in an unprecedented move, imposes significant economic sanctions against the Republic of Panama. Accusations of Noriega's involvement in drug trafficking also intensify in the American press. At the same time, in the United States, the debate over the handover of the Panama Canal and the Torrijos-Carter Treaty is reignited. Interest groups and the Republican Party in Congress argue that given these events in Panama and the country's political instability, the Torrijos-Carter Treaty should be renegotiated. They even called for the renewal of the Canal Zone concessions to the United States, seeking to delay or completely reverse the handover of the Panama Canal. Responding to the United States and Panamanian opposition groups calling for his resignation, Noriega, who maintained an anti-imperialist stance, claimed he was merely a pretext for United States continental domination in Panama. And that, I quote again, it was much easier to go against a single figure than against the libertarian ideals of a people. Noriega claimed the United States aimed, I quote, to destroy the Panamanian Defense Forces and himself, who I quote, no longer. He no longer responded unconditionally to Washington's interests, as well as in retaliation for the fact that Panama had claimed its position over the Canal Territory. Noriega also stated that the current confrontation with Washington arose when Noriega refused to allow Panamanian territory to continue being used to train the Nicaraguan Contras and to launch attacks from that country, since he did not want to turn Panama into an aggressor nation. As part of this political clash, a new milestone occurred on February 6, 1988, when Noriega was formally indicted by the United States federal grand juries under charges of drug trafficking, organized crime, and money laundering in the cities of Tampa and Miami. He was indicted at the same time as Pablo Escobar, thus making him a fugitive from United States justice. In Panama, the then constitutional president, Eric Del Valle, faced great external and internal pressure from both sides, and he eventually decides to turn his back on Noriega and proclaim his removal as commander of the Panamanian Defense Forces. But the Panamanian Assembly of Representatives, together with Noriega, reject this decision, which leads Noriega to publicly disavow Eric Del Valle as president of Panama, forcing Del Valle to flee to the United States, threatened by Noriega's supporters, thus allowing Noriega to maintain control of the country for the time being. On February 26, 1988, Manuel Solis Palma, an ally of Noriega, is appointed as acting minister of the presidency, replacing the position of president. In response to this situation, Washington raises the tone of its discourse and decides to expand the economic blockade against Panama. This fosters a severe economic crisis that leads the government to order the freezing of banks to prevent capital flight from Panama. During this time, the United States negotiates conditions for Noriega's removal from power, but these negotiations ultimately bear no fruit. Noriega's government. At the same time, information arrives that a possible United States military action is being considered more and more seriously. In the midst of this conflict in 1988, there was a new attempted coup in Panama, indirectly supported by the United States. In March of that year, a group of military officers tried to overthrow Noriega, but the poorly planned coup was quickly suppressed. Noriega then formed the so-called Dignity Battalions. In April 1988, these were several paramilitary units designed to reinforce the defense forces and suppress the protests that were spreading throughout the country. It's worth mentioning as an important fact that during his government, Manuel Noriega had as a key ally and almost as his right-hand man, an agent from the Mossad. That is, an Israeli intelligence officer named Mai Harari, who accompanied him for several years. At the end of 1988, on November 8th, the Republican candidate George Bush Sr. was elected as President of the United States. Bush and Noriega were not strangers, on the contrary. As a director of the CIA and vice president under Ronald Reagan, George Bush Sr. met with Noriega on more than one occasion as part of the collaboration he had with the United States. But despite this, Bush Sr. would maintain the same line as the administration that preceded Ronald Reagan, in which the American ruling class, apparently, had already decided to remove Noriega from power by any means necessary in favor of a new political class to govern Panama, one that was closer and more reliable to United States interests. The following year, on May 7, 1989, Panama once again held presidential elections. After a campaign filled with a lot of tension, Guillermo Endara, the opposition candidate, led a coalition against Noriega's candidate, Carlos Duque. When the election took place, international observers of the process indicated that Endara had won. But Noriega's regime ordered the election to be annulled, claiming interference by the United States in the process. The government appointed Comptroller Francisco Rodriguez as provisional president until new elections could be held in Panama. The United States, for its part, recognized Guillermo Endara as the legitimate president of a parallel government, and it explicitly insists that Noriega leave the presidency, either willingly or by force. This situation further exacerbates the political crisis in Panama, leading to another attempted coup against Noriega, this time directly supported by the United States. On October 3, 1989, several junior officers, led by Major Moises Giroldi Vera, whom Noriega had sponsored at his wedding, rise up against him. Although this second coup is better planned and coordinated by the Intelligence Brigade of the United States Southern Command, it also ends up failing due to Giroldi's indecision and the lack of promised support from the United States. The forces loyal to Noriega's regime completely crush this rebellion. Unlike the participants in the failed coup of March 1988, who were imprisoned, the officers who joined this attempt, along with Giroldi, including himself, are executed in what is known as the Albrook Massacre on the same October 3 as the coup. After this coup coordinated with the North American power, the tension between both nations escalates to levels never seen before, and the rhetoric of the United States government and that of Noriega becomes more aggressive and threatening. After the failed military rebellion, the Panamanian government was informed that the North American military option was being considered very seriously. In November 1989, Noriega declared Panama to be in a state of effective war, and in December, the National Assembly granted special powers to Noriega, formally appointing him as Chief of the War Cabinet. The event that will break the tense barriers and serve as a pretext to approve the military intervention in Panama. December 16, 1989 arrives when 4 American soldiers on Panamanian soil are allegedly attacked by members of the Panamanian Defense Forces, in circumstances that are still unclear today, resulting in the death of one of them. Some suggest that this episode was encouraged and planned by the United States itself to have a casus belli, although this has never been proven or clarified. The truth is that a few days after this, within the spheres of American power, it was definitely decided to go to war with Panama and to approve what would be the last United States military intervention during the Cold War, thus setting in motion what was called Operation Just Cause. The next day, once the military intervention had begun, which we will now describe to you in detail, President George Bush Sr. delivered a message to the world announcing the military operation and arguing that the United States was doing it to protect American lives in the Canal Zone and in Panama, to protect democracy in the region and to fight drug trafficking. Operation Just Cause started early on December 20, 1989. It was the most complex United States military operation since the Vietnam War, with a joint force of between 26,000 and 27,000 American soldiers. The planning and final training for the mission were intense and fast, aiming to catch the enemy by surprise. The United States forces have more than 300 military aircraft and hundreds of ground vehicles, both armored and unarmored. The main reason for this large military force is to quickly gain effective territorial control of the country and to prevent factions of the Panamanian army from fleeing to the mountains and trying to start a guerrilla war that could turn into a Vietnam 2.0. The importance that this operation has for the newly elected government of George Bush. In the use of some of the most powerful and modern military technologies that the United States had developed up to that point, such as the F-117A Nighthawk stealth fighters and the attack helicopter, 64 Apache attack helicopters, having their baptism of fire, not against a military power somewhere else on the planet, but against a much weaker enemy just a few kilometers from its borders. The Panama Defense Forces, which for a long time were nothing more than a National Guard, created and supported by the Americans themselves, consisted of only 16,000 men, most of whom were not prepared to fight and were mostly equipped with gear that was more outdated than their rivals. Not having the capacity to sustain a fight with the United States Army in this way, with total secrecy, the operation begins near midnight on December 19th, 1989. The seismic alarm goes off in Panama City, and minutes later the explosions start. A wave of United States fighter jets storms the sky and bombs key positions in Panama, such as the central headquarters of the Panamanian Defense Forces, several airports and military bases in Panama City and Colon. At the same time, they use artillery and aviation to bomb the most densely populated areas of the capital and the city of Colon. The Americans focused their bombings on popular areas like El Chorrillo, a neighborhood in the center of the capital that was a stronghold of supporters of Noriega's government. The devastation from the bombings and the significant collateral damage destroyed a large amount of infrastructure throughout the country and resulted in hundreds of innocent civilian casualties. At the same time, with high precision to thwart any reaction from the Panamanian forces, elements of the so-called Ford Circuit, which was a military operation to take control of strategic points in the country, captured Punta Paitilla Airport and destroyed Noriega's jets. The main targets of the invasion are the military centers, especially the command headquarters, which was the central general headquarters of the Panamanian Defense Forces. The surprise and violent attack by the Americans is effective, and the Panamanian headquarters is surrounded and neutralized. In a few hours, little by little, the strongholds of possible Panamanian resistance fall before a superior enemy. In Rio Hato, the F-117S drop a 2,000-pound bomb between the two barracks that housed hundreds of soldiers, and the United States Army Rangers parachute into the area. In the largest airborne operation since World War II during the invasion, it's worth noting the Panama Canal, which was quickly secured by the Americans to protect their military and civilian assets in the area and to block possible escape routes for Noriega, whose whereabouts are unknown in these initial moments of the invasion. However, the most complex task was that of Task Force Pioneer, which had to capture Fort Amador and protect the United States Embassy, which was beginning to be attacked by Panamanian forces. This United States military command fights hard, suffering several casualties in the process. Meanwhile, Delta forces carry out a smaller and more secret mission to free a United States spy from one of the most secure Panamanian prisons in the country. The international reaction to what was called Operation Just Cause is predominantly condemnatory. Several countries denounced the act of United States aggression as a clear violation of Panamanian sovereignty and international law. The United Nations General Assembly condemns the invader. Despite the criticism, United States forces continue their operations on Panamanian soil after the first night of the invasion. The United States had managed to capture most of its objectives, but the main target, Manuel Noriega, had managed to escape for 5 days. United States forces are searching for him relentlessly, but haven't succeeded, until they find out that he had taken refuge in the Apostolic Nunciature of the Holy See, that is, the embassy of the Vatican State in Panama. Knowing that they couldn't force their way in without further damaging their international image, the United States resorts to psychological warfare tactics. For a week, the American troops surrounded the building of the Apostolic Nunciature, camping outside and playing loud music non-stop through huge speakers. Rock and rap songs by bands like AC/DC Black Sabbath, or Guns N' Roses play incessantly. In addition, the soldiers revved their armored vehicles' engines and even set a nearby field on fire to create a heliport in order to harass the guests of the Apostolic Nunciature. These strategies are highly criticized, and even the Holy See complains to President Bush, who finally orders them to stop the music. After this, the American strategy added to the pressure from the Nunciature for Noriega to surrender and his inability to find a way out with effective support. On January 3, 1990, Noriega surrendered to the American authorities. He was arrested by men in Drug Enforcement Administration uniforms and transported on a C-130 plane to Miami, United States. Guillermo Endara, who had won the presidential elections in May 1989, became the new president of Panama. Thus, Operation Just Cause was declared concluded on January 31, 1990, after 41 days of execution. Panamanian casualty numbers from the invasion remain debated. Official United States figures report 314 Panamanian soldiers and 202 civilians killed, but unofficial sources place that number between 500 soldiers and 4,000 civilians dead. The invasion caused widespread damage to infrastructure throughout the country and created economic and social chaos, which was evident in looting and all kinds of skirmishes. El Chorrillo, the neighborhood hardest hit by the bombings, remains a symbol of war-torn Panama. As for Noriega, he was already in the United States. In April 1992, he was tried in the federal court of the Southern District of Florida in Miami on charges of money laundering, organized crime, and drug trafficking. Despite declaring himself a political prisoner, during the trial, he was only recognized as a prisoner of war, which allowed him to keep his military rank during the trial. Noriega denies all drug trafficking charges, and regarding the other accusations, he claims that all of them were carried out under instructions from the CIA and the United States government when he worked for them. But the Department of Justice considers this information classified and irrelevant. Noriega, during the trial, admits to having received money and acted under the direction of the United States in matters of intelligence, espionage, and counterinsurgency. But he states that he never admitted to being involved in drug trafficking activities, neither on his own nor on behalf of the United States, even going so far as to declare, I quote, "I was not a drug trafficker. I was a scapegoat, a disposable ally who became inconvenient." Meanwhile, his defense claims that in countries like Colombia, Peru, or Mexico, 10 times more drugs were produced or passed through directly, and that none of those countries had been the victim of a military invasion because of it. On their side, the American prosecutors present as the main support for their accusations the numerous testimonies of people involved at high levels of drug trafficking in Latin America. Testimonies Noriega believes are false or manipulated. One of them was the testimony of the famous drug lord Carlos Leader, who gave several statements accusing Noriega, and then he confessed to having given them in order to receive procedural benefits in the United States. In this regard, during the trial, the government stipulated that Noriega had received approximately $320,000 from the Navy and the CIA for their operations in Central America. Although Noriega insists to the court and the press that the real amount was about $10 million, in addition, the tasks he had carried out for the United States government under their instructions needed to be disclosed so that Noriega's true role in power could be put into perspective. On top of this, the trial against him was surrounded by irregularities, including the United States buying witnesses to testify against Noriega. He states in his memoirs that 26 of those who testified against him were drug traffickers, convicts, or political enemies, and that their testimonies and stories against him didn't even match. According to him, 3 years after the trial, at least half a dozen of those drug traffickers were recanting or threatening to recant their testimony. Even so, after a trial that deserves a separate video. Noriega is declared by the United States court to be guilty of 8 out of 10 charges for drug trafficking, organized crime, and money laundering. On April 9th of that year, 1992, he was sentenced to 40 years in prison. Since his bank accounts with $20 million were frozen, Noriega declared himself indigent, and Washington ended up paying his legal expenses, which were estimated at $6 million. Upon leaving the court, Noriega's defense attorney, Frank Rubino, stated that the verdict was not a victory over drug trafficking, but a victory for the foreign policy of the United States. And Noriega, for his part, would say that the United States, open quotes, needed a villain. I was convenient. The truth didn't matter, only the headlines. Close quotes. In total, it is estimated that the United States spent about $200 million to neutralize Noriega, including the military invasion. And what about the Panama Canal? A key element to understanding the importance of this story. Now, with a situation favorable to the Americans, and with all the arrangements and stipulations set by the Torrijos-Carmen Treaty, it was handed over to Panamanian control on December 31, 1999 at 12 noon in a solemn ceremony presided over by President Mireya Moscoso. The history of Panama after the invasion deserves other videos and reflections for another time. Noriega's sentence was reduced from 30 to 20 then to 15 years for good behavior. His sentence in the United States ended in September 2007, but his imprisonment was extended while the extradition requests from France and Panama for Noriega were being considered. In 2010, at the age of 76, Noriega was extradited to France, where he faced charges related to money laundering and was sentenced again to 7 years in prison. On December 11, 2011, after over 20 years in prison, Manuel Antonio Noriega was extradited and jailed in Panama's El Renacher Penitentiary Center in Panama. He faces sentences for the murders of opposition Dr. Hugo Espadafora, Major Moises Giroldi, the disappearance of Eleodoro Portugal, and other similar charges, adding up to 60 years in prison. However, Panamanian law at the time limited the maximum sentence to 20 years, which ended up being applied to him during his time in prison in Panama. His health deteriorated significantly, and in March 2012, he was diagnosed with a benign brain tumor. Despite several requests in January 2017, he was granted hospital house arrest due to his delicate state of health. He underwent surgery to remove the tumor on February 15, 2017. However, Noriega did not survive long and passed away on May 29, 2017. At the age of years old at Santo Tomas Hospital in Panama, after being in an induced coma since March, his funeral was private and his body was cremated in an intimate ceremony, with the ashes given to his wife, Felicidad Cierro. This being the end of Manuel Antonio Noriega Moreno, the death of Noriega, according to former Panamanian President Juan Carlos Varela, closes a chapter in the history of Panama, an episode that, according to many historians, has generally only been told. On one side was the tyrannical Noriega, who seized all power in the country, but less is said about Noriega, the CIA employee. A friend of Ronald Reagan and George Bush, who until just 2 years before the invasion was still receiving money from the United States for his work as a strategic enclave in Central America. For its part, Operation Just Cause marked a turning point in the political history of the country and the continent, both for those who celebrated it and for those who still bear the wounds. And the evaluations and judgments of these processes require, first of all, a basic, complete, and dispassionate understanding of what really happened. Just as life in Panama after the invasion deserves a separate documentary and approach, the complexity of Noriega's figure is still being studied and discussed, embodying the duality that marked the history of Panama, of Central America, and revealing the intrigues of United States international politics. Thank you for watching. Your support means a lot to us. By leaving your comments, giving it a like, subscribing to the channel, sharing the video with all your friends, and clicking the bell to activate notifications. This was Reynaldo Jose Carrillo Vilches speaking. This is the New Encyclopedia. As always, we thank you for all your support and many blessings to you all.